How is it possible that in a test where Ferrari does not even have access to the complete data, its own engineers were more surprised than ever with Lewis Hamilton? Because what happened at Fiorano didn't have to be relevant. It wasn't a performance test, it wasn't car development, it wasn't a key session. But still, what Hamilton did behind the wheel of the SF26 left an uncomfortable feeling within the team. The car has more potential than they themselves believed. And this is where the really shocking thing begins. Because we are not just talking about Hamilton being fast, we are talking about him finding things in the car that Ferrari had not seen. Neither in the simulator, nor in the tests, nor in months of work. The big question is inevitable. What did Hamilton see in that Ferrari that the engineers had not discovered? Ferrari arrived at Fiorano with a very clear idea of what its 2026 car was, with months of simulation, data correlation and structured work that, in theory, had already perfectly delimited the performance window of the SF26. Because in modern Formula 1 nothing is left to chance. Everything is measured, projected and validated before the car even hits the asphalt. But what no one within the team expected is that this controlled scenario would begin to break down precisely in a test where, in theory, absolutely nothing relevant was going to be discovered. The context is key to understanding what happened, because this test in Fiorano was not a conventional test. It was not a session to look for performance or to test evolutions. It was a limited wet tire test organized by Pirelli, where Ferrari could not work freely, could not test aggressive configurations and, most importantly, did not have access to the complete data that was generated on the track, which turned everything into an extremely restricted exercise from a technical point of view. Almost useless if we look at it from the traditional approach to development. And yet, it is precisely in that environment where the first sign appears that something does not fit, because the simple presence of Lewis Hamilton already breaks the expected script. Initially, it was not planned for him to drive in this test. The plan was for a reserve driver to assume that role, but his participation completely changes the internal reading of the team, because he is not just a driver riding, he is a 7-time world champion getting directly involved in a test that historically did not interest him, which within Ferrari is interpreted as a clear sign of total commitment to the project, but also as the beginning of something that no one had anticipated. From there, what begins as just another session becomes a silent turning point, because although Ferrari does not have full access to the data, it does have something equally valuable: the driver's feedback. And this is where Hamilton begins to make a brutal difference, not because of what he says in general terms, but because of how he says it, because of the level of detail with which he describes the behavior of the car in extreme conditions, in an environment where the majority of drivers would simply limit themselves to complying with the program without going too deep. What Hamilton transmits to the engineers is not superficial information, it is an advanced reading of the car. He begins to talk about sensations that do not entirely coincide with what Ferrari expected to find. He describes variations in stability, in the way the car enters a curve, in how the rear axle responds under conditions of low grip, and he does so with a precision that forces the team to rethink something fundamental. If these sensations are real, then the car does not behave exactly as its models predicted. And this is where the act changes level, because this is no longer about a driver adapting to a new car. It is about a driver who begins to discover areas of performance that were hidden, that had not been exploited even during the preseason tests, which generates a kind of internal shock in Ferrari, because his simulations had defined limits, clear references of how far the SF26 could go, but Hamilton begins to move beyond those limits, finding grip, stability, and efficiency in areas where, in theory, they shouldn't exist. This connects directly with what had already been seen at the beginning of the season, where Hamilton had shown a capacity to progressively adapt to the style of the car, even modifying his way of driving to get closer to Ferrari's philosophy, something that was already notable, but that in Fiorano evolves into something much more dangerous for his rivals. He no longer just adapts, he now begins to dominate and reinterpret the behavior of the car from within. And while all this is happening, there is a detail that makes it even more shocking. Ferrari should not be learning so much in this type of test. It should not be obtaining critical information in such a limited environment. But thanks to Hamilton, each lap becomes a piece of a much larger puzzle, one that begins to reveal that the SF26 has a wider performance window than they believed, and that perhaps, until now, they had not known how to unlock it. The problem, or the opportunity depending on how you look at it, is that this discovery does not come from a technical improvement, it does not come from an update, it comes from the way in which a driver is able to interpret the car, which raises a huge question within the team. If Hamilton can access that performance, what has Ferrari been doing until now without fully exploiting its own potential? And this is the basis of everything that comes after, because from this moment on, Ferrari no longer only has to develop the car, it has to understand it again, it has to reconstruct its own interpretation of the SF26 based on what Hamilton has begun to show at Fiorano, and that completely changes the internal rules of the game for the team. But this is where everything starts to get really complicated within Ferrari, because it is one thing for a driver to find performance, and quite another for that performance to not fit with everything the team thought it knew about its own car. As the engineers begin to piece together what Hamilton has been doing on the track, they run into an unexpected problem. The data doesn't fit perfectly with their models, it doesn't follow the logic they had established over months of simulation, and that in Formula One is a huge red flag, because it means there is a disconnect between what the car does in theory and what it can actually do when someone like Hamilton pushes it to the limit. And here the internal conflict arises because Ferrari has always worked under a very structured philosophy, where the simulator, correlation, and engineering define the path to follow, but now a variable appears that breaks that balance, a driver who not only executes, but indirectly questions that entire system with each lap, with each sensation he transmits, with each technical detail he puts on the table in the meetings. Hamilton begins to insist on car behavior that was not considered optimal. He talks about phases of the curve where the car can be more aggressive, about areas where braking can be delayed or a higher minimum speed can be maintained without losing stability, and this forces the engineers to review configurations that they had already ruled out, to rethink concepts that they believed were closed, generating a silent tension between what the data says and what the driver demonstrates on the track. The most delicate thing is that this is not something that can be resolved quickly, because Ferrari does not have all the test data as it is a Pirelli test, which means that they have to reconstruct the information indirectly, relying on partial telemetry, comparisons with previous sessions, and above all, on Hamilton's feedback, which further increases his influence within the team in this initial phase of the project. And this is where the impact becomes even more profound, because what Hamilton is proposing is not simply going faster, it is changing the way the car drives, which also means changing the direction of development, because if the SF26 has a wider performance window than expected, then Ferrari has been working within too conservative a margin, inadvertently limiting its own potential. This generates a very subtle but very real internal division. On the one hand, there is the team's traditional line, based on data, simulations, and established processes, and on the other hand, a new reference begins to emerge, that of Hamilton, which does not directly contradict the engineers, but does expand the framework of what is possible, forcing them to question whether they were really exploring the full potential of the car. Furthermore, this scenario becomes even more critical if we connect it to the start of the season, where Ferrari failed to show its true level in Australia and where Hamilton had already made it clear that the adaptation process was going to be more complex than expected, but also that there was room for improvement. And now in Fiorano that improvement is beginning to take shape, not as a technical evolution, but as an evolution in the understanding of the car. As the days go by after Fiorano, the engineers begin to work with a new obsession. It is not to improve the car from scratch, it is to unlock what Hamilton has already shown exists, which completely changes the direction of development, because they are no longer looking for theoretical performance, they are chasing something real, something that they already saw on the track, although they still do not fully understand how it is produced. This has an immediate effect on the way Ferrari faces the rest of the season, because if they manage to correlate what Hamilton feels with what the data says, they can open a much wider window of performance than they had planned, especially in key areas such as corner entry, braking stability, and the efficiency of the hybrid system, just the points where the Briton made a difference from the first moment. But here comes the most dangerous part for his rivals, because Hamilton is not only finding performance, he is accelerating the process of understanding the car, something that normally takes months in a regulation change like the one in 2026, and this means that Ferrari could get ahead of that learning curve, something that in Formula One is worth as much as a major aerodynamic update. And if we connect this with what was already seen in the first races, where Ferrari failed to reflect its true potential but maintain the internal conviction that the performance was there, now everything begins to fall into place, because Fiorano confirms that this potential exists, that it was not an illusion, that they simply had not found the right way to exploit it until now. This completely changes the internal balance of the team, because Hamilton goes from being a driver in adaptation to becoming a central piece of development, someone who not only executes what they give him, but also guides the technical direction with his ability to interpret the car, something that Ferrari had not had at this level for years. And here appears the great consequence that can define the entire season, because if Ferrari manages to translate everything that Hamilton has discovered in Fiorano into real and consistent improvements on the track, we would not only be seeing a more competitive car, we would be seeing a team that has found a new way of understanding its car, an advantage that does not appear in the initial data, but that can make the difference in the championship. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.